The most popular concern for paper 3 is the evaluation question, and while I understand this, I want to emphasize that if you have limited time, making subtle improvements on the evaluation will take a much larger effort than finding points elsewhere. I believe that students often overlook the 2 and 4 point questions in favor of the 6 and 10 point questions, which I understand because that is a 10-point question that seems very heavy. But as I just said, it might be easier to find points elsewhere rather than spend Herculean efforts to bring yourself up a few points on the evaluation. So this is a video with limited time in mind. So what could we do with these limited moments before the test? Well, we could talk about the hypothetical situations that often appear. I find, surprisingly, that students rush through this and therefore lose out on low-hanging fruit. In other words, there are some easy points available to you if you just read the context carefully and reuse some of that context. So here we have 2 questions. One is an early question, a hypothetical question, and one is the last question for each section, which is the evaluate question. So again, students really find that 10 points very attractive. They think there's a lot there to be mined. But to be honest with you, I've been teaching this for a very long time. It takes weeks, maybe months, to bring yourself up a few points on that evaluation. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of know-how to get a few points difference. And even if you work on this, the level of subjectivity involved in grading it is super high. So for example, I've been teaching this with a group of 5 teachers in the last couple of years. Sometimes I'll give a 7, someone else will give a 9. So there is a level of subjectivity that is hard to anticipate. But with the short stuff, the mark scheme is much more streamlined and less subjective. It seems to have bullet points often about things that should be there. Now, we do want to make sure we have content knowledge, and a lot of students prioritize the content knowledge over the application. So remember that a big part of the syllabus is not just knowledge, but being able to apply that knowledge to novel situations. So let's look at this question. I'm going to read it aloud. At the mall, Melina saw her best friend Leslie put a pair of earphones into her purse without the store clerk noticing. Later, Melina witnessed Leslie throw away the earphones and that her mood had changed from excitement to sadness. Explain 2 reasons that Melina may suspect that Leslie suffers from kleptomania. Some of the most high-achieving students I've seen make the mistake of rushing through this because they see there's a lot of tests left, all right? This may be the first question they see, and they just rush. And they see the word kleptomania, they focus on that word, and only look at the tail end of the question. Why does she have kleptomania? Oh, I know, kleptomania people, they often feel a rising excitement and then may feel guilt after the act, or they may steal things that they don't need. These are both correct, but what we're not doing is we're not weaving in our own words with a text on the stimulus question. So the metaphor I've been using is that we have to make sure that we're picking the low-hanging fruit in the early questions before we worry too much about the high-hanging fruit in the later questions. Do not miss out on this opportunity. It should go without saying that 1 point in the first question is worth as much as a point in a later question. It's a matter of effort. So again, please don't overlook the easy effort that is here. So let's come up with the 2-point response first. So let's say we knew information about kleptomania. We read the ICD-11, we read the textbook, great. But if you don't add those little details, and again, I've said this before, but don't just use the names, Melina and Leslie, but actually use some of the verbs and the nouns that appear in the stimulus to ensure that you're going to get full credit. So let's look at the first thing I wrote here. People who are kleptomaniacs usually do not need or use the items they steal. Great. How difficult would it be to mention the earphones? So Leslie throws away the earphones she steals, so the theft was not for personal gain. Same thing with the second point I'm making. Also, kleptomaniacs have a rising tension or a feeling of rising tension before the act, but often feel guilt afterwards. And again, we have something in the stimulus to link to. Leslie's sadness after the theft could be a sign of guilt. So I'm recycling some of the words I've seen in the stimulus. So it's a bit cut and paste, but it's not cut and paste without thinking. There is evidence of thinking based on your ability to apply general knowledge with a specific situation. Let's do another one. So here we have Jill. She has been looking unsuccessfully for a job for quite a while, but only feels a sense of mastery and accomplishment from gambling. When she beats older players, she feels especially powerful. She has not won for weeks, but she feels that her luck can change soon. Suggest how a behaviorist may explain her gambling habits. So I know about behaviorism. I could use words like positive reinforcement, or I could even talk more sophisticatedly about ratios of reinforcement. But what can I use in the actual stimulus text to link that? So ironically, the students who really have a good basis of content knowledge often get the hard points and they ignore the easy stuff. So the hard points would be stuff like jargon, positive reinforcement, schedules of reinforcement, etc. So people gamble due to positive reinforcement. This is a very general statement. How do we link it to Jill? Well, we could say she occasionally wins, but it hasn't happened for weeks, suggesting that positive reinforcement occurs on a variable ratio schedule. Excellent. So I'm using the word weeks that was recycled from the stimulus question. Same thing here. How may a cognitive psychologist explain her gambling? People may gamble due to triggers brought on by state-dependent memory. This is hearkening back to Miller's feeling state theory. The powerlessness of her unemployment triggers her attempt to recapture the feeling state of being powerful when winning. So the word unemployment has been recycled from the stimulus question and put in a context that explains feeling state theory a bit. So again, not hard. The blue might be harder because some people don't have the content knowledge, but the green is just waiting for you to link. All right, and here's one more example. It's a short stimulus, but you could do a lot with it. Keely has schizophrenia. She tells her therapist that she avoids talking to others because she believes they are searching for information that they can use against her one day. So here I am asked to come up with a positive and a negative symptom of schizophrenia, and if I just name a positive and a negative symptom, I'm only going to get half the credit, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 2. So I could say something like delusions of persecution, that's a point, evidenced by the belief that other people will use information against her. Negative symptom could be a lack of sociality or a lack of socializing or asociality. So I could just write the word asociality. I might get a point for identification, but I haven't explained it in context. So she avoids talking to people, which shows she is socially withdrawn, which is a negative symptom of schizophrenia. Okay, so to wrap up, hypothetical questions, the first and the third question of each section, have content knowledge interwoven with stimulus text. Be sure not to ignore the stimulus text. And I spent some time on this in the last few weeks because I feel that this is much easier to fix than evaluation problems. One of the reasons why evaluations are so hard to get right is partly because of the AS exam. Paper 1 in the AS exam had a very rigid strength, weakness format. This is less rigid, and sometimes it's not a good idea to talk about strengths and weaknesses, because if you're talking about something like free will determinism, this is a binary that does not need to exist on a positive or negative spectrum. Okay, so I am not going to revisit too deeply the format of evaluative essays. I will remind you that in order to get top tier marks, you need to have at least 3 evaluative topics. Students are given some degree of freedom about what they could choose to evaluate in terms of the topics, the evaluative topics. Please, of course, make sure you do the named issue. I would do it first because without it, you cannot score majority credit. So I've categorized evaluative questions into 3 categories, and I think that the easiest evaluative topic you could possibly get, and when I say evaluation, I mean both describe and evaluate. Of course, describe is 6 points, evaluate is 10 points. But just for convenience, I'll call it an evaluative topic. So the easiest one you could be asked is a case study. And why is that the easiest? Well, we've prioritized the case studies. That's one reason. But a second reason is that it's laser focused on just one study. So you don't need to bring in more than one idea per paragraph. You could still be nuanced. You could still use words like however, even though, but you don't need to constantly be doing this switching in the middle of the paragraph from one idea to another. So evaluate the study by Grant et al. Beautiful question that I would love to have. A little bit more difficult would be one of those what I call EG studies, for the example studies that the syllabus recommends. So let's look at this question. Evaluate what psychologists have discovered about covert sensitization and imaginal desensitization. Now it's nice that they give us those 2 bullet points because we know what the paragraphing structure will be for the describe section. When it comes to the evaluation section, it's a little bit troublesome because now we have to put 2 ideas per paragraph, not just one as we would have with the Grant study. But for both the case study and the EG studies, what the nice thing is that these are based on empiricism, and therefore all evaluative topics are available to us. That includes issues and debates, methodology, and GRAVE. But what if they give us a topic that was presented theoretically? For example, evaluate what psychologists have discovered about behavioral and cognitive causes of impulse control disorders. If you go to the syllabus, there is nothing there for behavioral other than the phrase positive reinforcement. And there is nothing there for cognitive other than feeling state theory, which is nice because it is written by an author, but it's not really purely empirical research. So this type of question to me would be the most difficult because you are closed off from doing generalizability, reliability, validity, and ethics. I mean, I guess you could still do these things, but they're not based on empirical details, and therefore there's less likely to be a link. So when it comes to a no study evaluation, I might gravitate more towards issues and debates or usefulness. If we know about behavioral causes of gambling, can we use that knowledge to counter condition gambling addiction or something like that? To summarize, there are 3 types of evaluative questions: key studies, EG studies, or no studies. I hope for most of your sake that it's either a key study or an EG study. When it's no study, it becomes difficult. I would have a hard time with making a very richly detailed describe and evaluate if it's no study. Now, I have presented research for these things, but again, it's not explicitly stated on the syllabus and often will not be explicitly stated on a mark scheme. So as an example, let's take the middle choice. Let's take the middle difficulty, the EG study. So here I have 3 paragraphs that are not complete because I can't squeeze an entire essay on a slide, and also I'm slightly lazy. So I have 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph is free will determinism, and that's because that's the named issue and I want to get it done. The second issue is the use of a case study, which is fine because these are based on case studies, so methodology is there. And then the last thing I do is a GRAVE typical point, which is ethics. And I think these 3 things are very distinct from each other so that the paragraphs are not going to repeat too much. Free will determinism, use of case studies, ethics, I think these are very distinct from one another. Can you use the word strength and weakness? Yes, you can, but again, you don't need to think in terms of strength and weaknesses. And if you do, you could say it's a strength and a weakness. You could be nuanced. You don't have to separate those 2 concepts into different paragraphs. Okay, so many teachers use the GRAVE method to remember ways that you could evaluate empirical things. And if it's not empirical, if it's a no study, like I said before, you probably want to gravitate more towards issues and debates. And the acronym I sometimes use if I'm like struggling to remember what those issues and debates are is RAIN dice, reduction, application, idiographic, nature, nurture, determinism, individual, children, and cultural difference, which I call here ethnocentric bias. Someone asked me, is there a difference between application and usefulness? Technically, yes, but it's so subtle, I wouldn't worry about it. So oftentimes, we use them as synonyms for each other. All right, so again, just be aware that some parts of the syllabus are not specifically using the phrase including a study. Look how bare and generic this is. Biochemical explanations of OCD, genetic explanations of OCD. Not much to work with there. So hopefully you've looked at a hotter textbook or you remember some jargon that would be appropriate. Genetics can be annoying because you have to remember all of these acronyms for various genes, but if you're not a person who's capable of remembering things like 5-HTT or DRD4, you could easily just remember a concordance study. For example, Gottsman, who we've seen when we talked about schizophrenia, also did studies on OCD, monozygotic 87% concordance rate, dizygotic 47% concordance rate. So if one twin has OCD, the chances of the other having it, if this is true, is based upon those percentages there. So very high percentage or very high likelihood of genetic components for OCD. But some students want to go further. Some textbooks mention many genes. I believe the Hotter book mentions these four: 5-HTT, DRD4, COMT, SLIT-RK5. Personally, I would not do well if I tried to remember all of them, but I might remember one of them. The one that I found the most interesting was the SLIT-RK5, and we talked about a study involving mice who had their SLIT-RK5 gene knocked out. So this is a perfect example of general information turned into something more specific through the use of secondary resources like your textbook or your teacher. Similarly, when we talk about cognitive causes of OCD, there's nothing there that says you must talk about Rockman, but Rockman is very often used in this discussion because he's the one who came up with the phrase thought, action, fusion. Okay, I'm not going to go through these, but you could pause the screen if you're interested in thought, action, fusion. The main purpose of this, again, is to illustrate that some of the studies that we mention are things that are not written explicitly in the syllabus. So when I say no study, I mean what that really means is that there's no mandatory study, but you could use a study if you have it. One more example, the syllabus talks about acupuncture, but it doesn't tell us much about it. And it also does the same thing with TENS, T-E-N-S. These are alternative treatments for pain. So what I did here, I chose to teach something that would kill two birds with one stone. There was a study in Japan where they looked at the efficacy of both acupuncture and TENS, and then looked at the efficacy of both of them combined together. So hopefully you have something you could talk about if they ask about acupuncture, but even if you don't, you might be able to survive if you could talk about perhaps how it might work based upon something like gate control theory. Or you could talk about how it works. It's going to be really difficult to get long paragraphs from the no study questions. And this is why I believe that sometimes the tests are not completely fair. For example, if you were studying clinical and consumer and another school was studying clinical and health, maybe the health question was a key study, whereas the consumer study was more abstract, or an EG study. So even though the grade thresholds are the same for the same time zone, not all students have an equal experience of this exam, and that's just one of the unfortunate realities of these. I wish that Cambridge would standardize it so that if you had a case study in consumer, you'll also get one in health, just so there's a little bit more consistency in the level of difficulty, but that has not been the case. At least I don't believe it has been the case so far. All right, hope this was helpful. I hope this was short. I don't know, I tend to blather on, but good luck. And I cannot answer questions 24 hours prior to an exam.